All right. How y'all beautiful people doing? Hope y'all doing well. All right, we'll be talking about an interesting subject today. We'll be talking about the subject of divorce and remarriage. As some of y'all might know, there is a lot of different teachings on the subject. There's a lot of different approach. There's a lot of different views. Some people are much more restrictive with divorce and remarriage. Other people are more permissive, depending what flavor of religion you are, if I can use that term to be pure. And so tonight we are going to actually go over a video from a Messianic Jew that is going to give his take on divorce and remarriage. So being a Messianic Jew, I'm assuming that he knows Torah, he knows the law, and also he being Messianic, he must adhere to the words of Jesus Christ, right? The Messiah, the Savior. So let's see if he can bring some good balance, and we'll go over that together. So let's delve right into it.
To make a donation, visit biblicallycorrectpodcast.org/donate. And if you enjoy this episode, please like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Thank you for your support. Okay, let's talk about divorce. Welcome to the Biblically Correct Podcast. Shalom, y'all. This is the Biblically Correct Podcast, teaching biblical correctness in a biblically incorrect world. My name is Kevin Jeffrey. I am a Jewish follower of the Messiah Yeshua, Jesus, and I love teaching the scriptures. God hates divorce. That's what it says in Malachi 2:16. And the rest of the Bible by no means has anything even close to good to say about it. And yet, no-fault divorce is rampant in the body of Messiah today, destroying families, ruining our collective testimony for Yeshua, and compromising the word of God. Why? Because too many believers have fallen for the lie that it's better to be happy than to stay married. They've given in to the influences of the world that tell them that breaking up can be justified over working it out, that personal feelings are more important than family. In today's episode, we're going to look at what the scriptures say about divorce. Does God permit divorce? Does he allow remarriage? And if so, under what circumstances? Finally, I'll conclude with some biblically based advice for believers who've been divorced, gotten remarried after divorce, or are right now considering divorce or remarriage. Because you may have, or may be in the process of, committing the biggest sin of your life.
Okay. Wow. Well, that's quite the introduction. So far, so good to me. He did mention a lot of good points. That divorce, it is true that when you read about it in the Bible, it is very often painted in negative light. It is hardly ever, I don't remember actually ever it being painted in a positive light. Also, when he mentioned about no-fault divorce, this is absolutely true in this world today. In the secular world, they do not really align the teachings of divorce with the secular courts out there. So they're pretty much aside from that. So absolutely, I do agree that a lot of families, unfortunately, they've been influenced by today's world and the court systems with this no-fault divorce policy. So hey, so far so good. Seems to be making a lot of sense to me. Let's see what he's got to say further on.
And just to give you fair warning, some of the scriptures I'm about to cover can get kind of confusing and messy. So you may have to focus a little bit harder than normal, but I'll try to keep it simple yet thorough and unravel things the best I can. Okay? Now, marriage is, of course, a deeply serious topic to God, which ought to be obvious from the fact that it's one of the very first things that he ever created. The Master Yeshua, quoting from the book of Genesis, reminds us of this, teaching us in Mark chapter 10, verses 6-8, that from the beginning of the creation, God made them a male and a female.
All right. So far, we do agree with the fact that marriage is extremely important. It is the foundation. It is talked about in the beginning, the book of Genesis, and it is talked about throughout the scriptures, all the way to the end, the last book, the book of Revelation, being the marriage supper of the Lamb. So marriage is absolutely huge. It is extremely important, and it is foundational to the faith and the covenant.
On this account will a man leave his father and mother and will be joined to his wife, and they, the two, will be for one flesh. So that Yeshua says they are no longer two, but one flesh. And from this, Yeshua then makes his pronouncement in verse 9 concerning divorce. Therefore, what God joined together, let not man separate. So,
okay, so this is really important, right? This is a huge, important statement there that Jesus made. Therefore, and I'm going to bring in a caveat to that, right? So therefore, what God joined together, let no man put asunder. All right. Now, if we look here, just to bring a little caveat, right? If we look here in the book of Exodus, right? It says in verse 4, Exodus 21, verse 4, it says, if his master have given him a wife, and she have borne him sons and daughters, the wife and her children shall be her masters, and he shall go out by himself. So this is actually talking about a servant, all right, that has a master, and his master, he's given him wife, and then afterwards the servant would go out of his master's house, and he would not go with his children and his wife. So wait a minute, we just heard what God put together, let no man put asunder. So there's no contradiction here. This is important to understand, is that in this case, God did not put these two together, the man and the woman. It was the master that put these together, that put this union together. And that's why there is a separation. That's why when the servant comes out of his master's house, there is separation. They are put asunder. So that's just a little important caveat. So it's important to understand what is actual biblical marriage, what is actual union, what is actually a union being put together by the Most High Yah, and what is being put together by man. Hallelujah. All right.
the marriage between one man and one woman was created by God in the beginning. And according to Yeshua, to divorce is to separate something that God himself has joined together. In fact, the scriptures portray marriage as a covenant, as we see in verses such as Malachi 2:14 and also in Ezekiel 16:8. So to divorce is to break a covenant and to tear into two what the creator of the universe had previously made into one. So the question is, which was posed to Yeshua by the Pharisees here in Mark 10, as well as in the parallel passage in Matthew 19, is it permitted for a man to send away his wife in divorce for every cause?
All right, so this is real big, and this is really important. And right there, this gives you the premise from where all these, a lot of these misunderstanding comes from. So first of all, we see that the Pharisees, they're much more liberal when it comes to divorce. They are much more liberal. You can put your woman away for various causes, all right? And this is what a lot of the people that support divorce, they kind of come from the same approach from the Pharisees, where they're very, very liberal, all right? So this is important to understand. That's an important premise here.
We'll later apply this question to the woman as well. And the Pharisees made the argument in favor of divorce, saying that Moses allowed a man to write a document of divorce and to send her away.
See, and exactly, and that's what's going on. A lot of people, they will point, when the subject of divorce comes, they'll be like the Pharisees. They'll point right back to Deuteronomy 21. They'll be like, look, This is the provision for divorce, all right? But what does Jesus has to say?
And by the letter of the law, they're right. So let's start with Moses to see what the Torah has to say about divorce. So the topic of divorce in the Torah, as in most of Scripture, is dealt with from the perspective of a man divorcing his wife. It doesn't address women divorcing husbands at all. Maybe that wasn't a thing at the time. And the passage that the Pharisees are referring to is in Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, which says that when a man takes a wife and has married her, and it has been, if she does not find favor in his eyes, for he has found in her a thing of disgrace, and he has written for her a document of divorce, and has given it into her hand, and has sent her out of his house. And the sentence goes on into a related topic, not finishing for several more verses. So the answer to the question of, does God permit divorce despite hating it? The answer apparently is yes. This passage is describing exactly what the Pharisees said. The husband writes a document of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her away. The sending away is the divorce. And he can do this, according to this passage, not for no reason, but because she doesn't find favor in his eyes, because he's found something disgraceful in her. Other translations say that he finds something indecent about her or unclean. The Hebrew here actually literally says naked. So perhaps this is some kind of sexual disgrace. It's unclear. So while
It is most likely, definitely, a sexual disgrace, immorality, because Jesus confirms that, and we're going to go into that later, when he says that a man can only divorce by cause of fornication. So in Deuteronomy 21, the disgrace or the uncleanness, it is actually a form of sexual immorality. It is a form of uncleanness where it's not like the emission of semen, where someone is unclean until even. That's more when that woman, she becomes defiled. And there's a difference between being unclean and defiled. There are some things, there are some state of defilement that are perpetual, that you cannot undo, you cannot get cleansed from. A good example is unclean animals. You cannot make a swine pure. You cannot make a camel clean, right? So there's different important distinctions, right? Let's move on.
this doesn't appear to support the idea that a husband can divorce his wife for every cause, as the Pharisees suggested. The way it's written is nevertheless extremely vague. We also see the concept of the divorce document crop up later in Isaiah 50 and Jeremiah 3. In the
See, the reason I submit that the reason why it's extremely vague is because there had to be the opportunity for the man to be wrong. Not necessarily the woman to be wrong, but the man to be wrong. So it could be that a man, he perceived something unclean in his woman that was not there. And that is why, let's say that he puts her out wrongfully, all right? That's why when you keep reading in Deuteronomy 24, verse 2, 3, and 4, it says that at that point, the woman, she can go out and be another man's wife. But it tells us that after she is with that second man, she becomes defiled. So if a woman has just an inkling of the Holy Spirit in her and is unreproachable in the matter, when she's wrongfully put away, she's not going to go jump to the next man. She's going to wait it out. She's going to wait on Yah, because if she was not put out, if she was not divorced for sleeping out or being unfaithful, then this means she's wrongfully being dismissed. And then at that point, if she is pure, being the woman of only one man, being touched by only one man, then if she goes out, then she's going to be defiled. So she's going to wait it out. and she's going to try to be reconciled to her husband. And her husband, if he's not completely dead inside, he will come to the Most High is going to deal with him, and he's going to come to his senses, and he would take his wife back. So I believe this is why the uncleanness is somewhat ambiguous, is because we have free will. Woman's got free will, man's got free will. There needs to be the opportunity of the circumstance where someone might be wrong. Let's move ahead.
Context of Israel's national infidelity in going after other gods. So even in God's metaphoric language toward Israel, where he is the husband and Israel is the wife, the husband divorces his wife because of the wife's behavior. Israel, by her actions, gave God cause to want to divorce her. And it's worth noting that what drives God to that point is Israel's unfaithfulness and her breaking of the covenant. So the Pharisees were correct that Moses does allow a man to write his wife a document of divorce and send her away. But what does Yeshua say to this in response? In Matthew 19, verse 8, Yeshua tells us why Moses permits it, and it's not good. He replies, Moses, for your stiffness of heart, allowed you to send away your wives. But from the beginning, it has not been so.
See now the stiffness of heart. Now this is another saying. Sometimes it's translated as hardness of heart. It is like a vague saying, but what is it meaning? What does it mean? Y'all go and read about Nabal and Abigail when his heart turned into stone. Could it mean when Jesus is saying because of the hardness of your heart, could it mean that he's actually telling them, you people, y'all are actually dead inside, man? So that's why you were allowed to put your wife away, because it's as if you died to the grave. She's released. She's no longer bound by the law of her husband being alive because y'all are dead inside. And that's why these women, you can release them so they can be free and they can move on into the renewing of life, the newness of life. Could it be that that's what Jesus was saying?
In other words, God's plan for marriage does not include divorce. Marriage is a lifelong joining by God of two people into one that should never be broken. So God's permitting of divorce then, through Moses, is in fact a concession because of the hardness of people's hearts. God doesn't condone divorce, nor does he approve of it. He simply allows it because married people can be ugly and terrible and destructive to each other. Stiffness of heart isn't grounds for divorce. It's just the reason that Moses allowed it. And yet, Yeshua is quick to remind us that from the beginning, divorce was never the plan. And for very good reason, as Yeshua then goes on to explain. Because even though Moses permits divorce, that doesn't mean that it's free from highly severe consequences. There's a huge trade-off for that allowance, beside the fact that you have to go against Yeshua's word to do it. Because not only does divorce ruin families, not only does it tear apart a God-joined union, but divorce is extremely likely because of our own decisions to turn us into adulterers. And the biblical penalty for adultery, according to Leviticus 20 and Deuteronomy 22, is death. So this is nothing to take lightly. But doesn't adultery mean being sexually involved with someone other than your spouse? How then, if you've gotten divorced, can you commit adultery?
So just a little caveat also is that we have to recognize, and a lot of people, they miss that. The repercussion for adultery was not always death. Stoning was not always the result of adultery. You cannot ignore the law where it says that when it comes to putting someone to death, by this form of punishment, that there always had to be at least two witnesses. One witness was never enough to put someone to death. So this is an important part to understand, because there were some situations of adultery that did not result in death, but it resulted in other different repercussions, severe repercussions that was equated with death.
Well, according to Yeshua, that's exactly what you're doing. In Luke 16, verse 18, the Master plainly says, "Everyone who is sending away or divorcing his wife and marrying another commits adultery. And he who is marrying her who is sent away from a husband commits adultery." So here in this one verse, we learn three things about how divorce leads to adultery. One, that a man who divorces his wife and then remarries commits adultery. Two.
All right. So now it's important to understand that adultery is always tied to the status of a woman. Okay. So it is always a woman that is adulterated. And that has to do with the mixing of seed, because a woman was created to know only one man all her life. Okay. So a man, we know that a man, he's the one that deposits the seed. All right. The woman is the ground. We know that a man can have more than one woman. We see that often in the patriarchs, in the scripture. All right. So, but yet and still, all right. And see, we cannot deny and reject. We have to try to understand what Jesus is trying to say. He is saying that if he puts away his wife, so that is for unjust cause, that is for he's not justified, and marries another, it doesn't talk about the status of that other woman. Is she a virgin? Is she divorced, widowed? Regardless, even if she would be virgin, according to the words of Jesus, he commits adultery. All right. So that could have to do with the spiritual adultery that Israel was being referred to earlier, right? Where when you're not following the faith, when you're not following the mandates, all right, and the instructions, all right, then what are you following? What God are you serving? What mandate? What law are you observing? You're observing another law that is not of the Most High Yah. So that could be what Jesus is saying, where he's committing adultery. That could have to do with spiritual adultery, or he could just be saying, he could be talking about defilement. The man is now being defiled, as a woman would be, because defilement has to do with your status being lowered, your honor, your dignity, your integrity being stripped away from you by merely your actions, therefore being defiled and receiving lower status. So these are all things that need to be strongly considered. And it's not about, a lot of the problem, what I'm seeing in a lot of the Torah communities, unfortunately, is that because we don't understand the words of Jesus, because it might be complex, complicated to understand, or a bit on the mysterious side or vague side, then we automatically jump to, it's just mistranslations. It's mistranslated. Then they put in like variants like apollo and apostasion, and they add all these things to try to make sense of it that really has nothing to do. It just brings more confusion. Let's move on.
That the man who marries the divorced wife also commits adultery.
Okay, so this absolutely makes sense. So the woman that is divorced, that is put away, all right? So let's say she was a virgin and she was married to that man, and she's known that man all her days, only one man. Now, that man, if he puts her away, all right, whether she's been running off on him or not, whether she's justified or not, all right, once that second man takes that woman and marries her, she's adulterated, because it's talking about the law of mixing seed. A woman was only created to receive one man all her life. So that's what Jesus is saying. A woman that is divorced, when another man takes her, he commits adultery, because the woman is not supposed to be outside their with another man. She's supposed to be with her husband. All right. And if you look at the laws in Leviticus, all right, now, and this is important to understand, these are the standard. All right. These are the standards for priests and high priests. All right. Check this out. All right. These are the standards. So Leviticus 20:14 says, a widow or divorced woman or profane or a harlot, these shall he not take, but he shall take a virgin of his own people to wife. Now, okay, this is the law to the high priest. All right. We understand that this only applies to the law to the high priest, not to the whole of Israel. But we still have to understand, anybody that's got an inkling of understanding will understand that the standard of the priests and high priests, these were the highest standard to holiness. So the Most High, he's actually trying to tell us something. For the people that really try to understand the will of the Most High and try to seek his kingdom first. These are all things that need to be considered, even if these were laws to the priests and the high priests. I mean, what do you think? Do you not think David not knew about the standard of the priests, how he was out and he was able to go and get fed with the shewbread because he was not defiled, having not known woman? See, these are a law for the high priest, but he was benefiting from that. But David wasn't a priest. Y'all get what I'm trying to say? The laws for the priests and the high priest were the standard of the highest level of holiness. Hallelujah.
Which leads to 3, the very important conclusion that it's not the divorce alone, but remarriage that causes the adultery. Why? Well, presumably because in the eyes of God, the man and his wife.
It's not the divorce that causes the adultery, at least for the woman, because if the woman is divorced and she remains single, she's not adulterated. There's not the mixing of seed. There's not that second man that introduces himself in her. So no, it's not the divorce that causes the adultery. The divorce is supposed to be there because she is already adulterated and defiled, sleeping out with another man, and that's why she's divorced. But in the case she is wrongly divorced and she didn't do nothing wrong, and she's always been faithful to her man all her life, one man, and she's being divorced, put away, no, there's no adultery in her until she would go out and get married to another man. Then once that man would insert himself in her, then she would be adulterated or defiled.
Are still one flesh. It's adultery because, regardless of what that legal divorce document says, as far as God is concerned, you're still married. In fact, Yeshua's teaching on divorce in Matthew 5 hints at this, when he also cites the passage in Deuteronomy 24 about the divorce document, and then says, but I say to you that divorce leads to adultery. I'm paraphrasing. It's a similar judgment that he makes a few verses earlier when he says, you heard that it was said, you must not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who is looking on a woman to covet her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. In this whole section of Matthew 5, he's saying, this is what the Torah says, but the fullness of the command is this. So this is how Yeshua can conclude or decide that even though Moses permits divorce, divorce and remarriage are actual adultery. And I'll swing back around to Matthew 5 shortly. Now in Matthew chapter 10, verses 11 and 12, we get some additional information.
So he said, if I understand correctly, divorce and remarriage are adultery. I guess in most cases, yeah. But like I mentioned, in the case where divorce is done because of hardness of heart, a stony heart, someone that is dead inside, walking dead man, like they say, is that then remarriage for the other spouse? Would that be adultery? Not too sure about that. See, these are things got to be considered.
Master says again, whoever sends his wife away and marries another commits adultery against her. But then he adds, and if she, sending away her husband, marries another, she commits adultery. So, unlike the husband only perspective on divorce that we find in the Torah, apparently by Yeshua's time, it was also permitted for a woman to divorce her husband. So, Yeshua is dealing with both sides of it here in Mark. And as in Luke, it's again not the act of divorce alone that causes the adultery, but the subsequent remarriages. So, in addition to a man divorcing his wife and remarrying being adultery, a wife who divorces her husband and remarries also commits adultery. Now, in an attempt to make things a little less confusing for you, I'll just tell you, without looking at the verses yet, that in Matthew 5 and
Okay, hold on. So, in the context where the man divorces his wife and remarries, it is only adultery for him if he put out his wife unjustly, her being without fault. If the woman is at fault and was unfaithful to him, and he divorced her and then marries another, the man is not at fault. The man is allowed to remarry because the woman went and slept out on him and was unfaithful to him.
Matthew 19, Yeshua repeats that a man who divorces his wife and remarries commits adultery. And the man who marries the divorced wife also commits adultery. Then in Matthew 5, Yeshua also says that a man who divorces his wife makes her commit adultery. And this is a little weird, since in none of Yeshua's other teachings on divorce does he indicate that divorce alone without remarriage results in adultery. So it seems that makes her commit adultery is implying that as a result of the divorce, she will eventually remarry and thus commit adultery. Now, it doesn't literally say that.
So there's an important thing that we're missing that we need to understand, all right? And I don't know if he's going to talk about that, but I will, because it's so important, all right? This is really important in order to understand what Jesus is saying, okay? So Romans 7, all right, starting at verse 2. So for the woman which had an husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lived. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. So then if while her husband lived, she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. So now with this understanding from the apostle, now we have a better understanding of what Jesus is saying. It's important to have these understanding. It's important to have these understanding because it adds a lot, because we were talking about stony hearts, hardness of heart being equated to death. When we add all these things, right?
But I think that's a reasonable conclusion. And what's also different here is that by saying that the man makes her commit adultery, it's saying that the divorce isn't all her fault in this instance. Therefore, the husband shares responsibility for her adultery. Now, before we keep going, let's stop for a minute and review what we have so far. Through divorce and remarriage, every single person involved, from the divorced husband to the divorced wife to the man who marries the divorced woman, every single one of them ends up committing adultery.
That is not true. That is not true. Everyone who divorces and remarries, the only context, all right, so we have husband, wife, and other man. So if the woman is divorced and she remarries, then being with that second man, she will be adulterated. That other man, he will be the cause of adultery. Now the husband, if he put away his woman, if he divorced her because she was unfaithful, he is not committing adultery. Because Jesus says that a man can put away his woman by sexual immorality if she's unfaithful to him. So he's not committing adultery if he justly put her away. He's committing adultery if he unjustly put her away. So in the case of a woman, where she is unjustly put away, where she didn't do nothing, she's without fault, without reproach, what she needs to do, and you can read that according to the wisdom of the apostles, she needs to remain single or then be reconciled to her husband so that she does not become adulterated. If she's kind of like, and it really sucks to say, but you know what? That's the cards the Most High played with the woman. If she remains kind of like in this limbo, if I can use this term to be pure, right, where the husband, he doesn't want to hear nothing and she didn't do nothing wrong, she needs to wait it out. She needs to wait on Yah so that he can address the issue. If the elders can get to him, if there's no man of wisdom that can get to this wicked ass man that unjustly put away his woman, she needs to ensure that she does not end up being adulterated, defiled by that second man. So she needs to stay, in this case, single, or wait for that death on that wicked man's ass. And once she can confirm his death, then she is free and she's at liberty to go and remarry. See, this is appropriate justification for remarriage,
according to Yeshua. And since Yeshua opened the door on wives divorcing husbands, I think it's reasonable to extrapolate out that a woman who divorces her husband makes him commit adultery in the manner we discussed.
All right, so a woman is not permitted to leave her husband. The apostle says not to leave, for a woman not to leave her husband. So 1 Corinthians 7:13. And so, and the woman which had an husband that believed not, and if he be pleased with her, let her not leave him. And there's another part where it says, let her not depart. I don't want to, it's the Bible does not permit a woman to leave her husband. All right. Especially not a righteous man. So I don't want to stretch out too much. I can put the verses there in the chat, but let's move along.
And also, a woman who marries a divorced man also commits adultery. Going strictly by what the scripture says, Yeshua is, in fact, silent on these two scenarios. But again, based on the scriptures we do have, I think it's reasonable to include these in our matrix. The point of all this is that adultery is the deathly, inescapable consequence of divorce. Despite divorce's technical permissiveness by Moses, if you divorce and remarry or participate in remarriage, you will have to one day stand before God and make account for your adultery. That's not my opinion. That's Yeshua's word. Based on what we've seen so far, the only way to avoid committing adultery after divorce is to never remarry. Because the fact of the matter is that you can technically divorce your spouse. You'll just need to remain unmarried in every sense of the word, including unofficial marriage-style relationships for the rest of your life.
See, that is only partly true. That is not true. If a woman has been divorced and then her husband dies, she can remarry. She can remarry, especially if she had no children. A man, we know that he's not even bound to having only one woman. A man can marry 2 or 3 women. So this is only partly true.
Now, all that said, Yeshua does make one specific exception that allows for divorce and remarriage that does not lead to adultery. And that is in the case of marital infidelity, specifically sexual unfaithfulness. In other words, if your spouse has already committed actual adultery through physical intimacy with another person. Yeshua says in Matthew 5, verse 32, "But I, I say to you that everyone who sends away his wife, except for the matter of sexual unfaithfulness, makes her commit adultery. And in Matthew 19, verse 9, he says, whoever sends away his wife, except for sexual unfaithfulness, and marries another, commits adultery. So in the first case where there's sexual unfaithfulness, the reason the man no longer makes his wife commit adultery by divorcing her is because she's already literally committed adultery. And in the second case, the man doesn't commit adultery by remarrying.
See, now that is true. That is true. The woman is already adulterated, already damaged goods, you know? It's only the first dent on the car that really hurts. Right? So yeah, go and be all the other man's wife you want to be. That is true.
Marrying for the same reason, because his wife was sexually unfaithful and broke the marriage covenant. In this case, the implication is that the man has been released from the marriage and is now free to remarry. That's the exception for the man. And if we're still extrapolating, because it doesn't say so explicitly, but based on what Yeshua said about women divorcing their husbands in Mark, it's reasonable to conclude that a woman can also divorce her husband and remarry if he was sexually unfaithful. Sexual unfaithfulness or adultery breaks the marriage covenant.
Nope. That's not true. That is not true. Where did Jesus say that? Where did Jesus say that the woman can divorce her man? The only reason she can divorce her man is if he commits sexual immorality. Where the hell is that? Jesus is addressing the man. The divorce can only come by a man. A man can only put a woman out. The woman cannot put a man out. The only way that a woman can put a man out is if the Most High gets to his wicked damn ass and slays him and kills him. It's the only way a woman can get free from that marriage. So, and that includes being dead inside. That does not just death is not just by when the breath comes out of your body, because there are some provisions that a man needs to provide for his woman. The word says, if a man provide not for his own, especially his own household, he is worse than an infidel. You think the Most High is not going to take care of that? No, don't worry. The woman, he's going to set the woman free. Don't worry, believe me. See, but that's the thing, is we don't wait on Yah. We're just all up in the carnalities and the flesh, and we don't wait on Yah. Anyways, moving on.
It violates what God joined together, and Yeshua says that in this case, it's an exception to the rule of divorce and remarriage becoming adultery. So sexual unfaithfulness, physical adultery with another person, is the only exception that the scriptures make for a clean divorce and remarriage. And I'll comment on some of the things in the gray area near the end of this teaching. Now, there's one more passage that we still need to consider, and that's Paul's teaching on divorce in 1 Corinthians 7. In this chapter, Paul's covering a whole host of topics related to marriage and sexual immorality. And his brief instructions on divorce begin in verse 10. And to the married I command, not I, but the master, let a wife not separate from a husband.
So that's exactly the verse I was looking for earlier. Okay? The woman cannot divorce her husband.
But even if she separates, let her remain unmarried, or let her be reconciled to the husband. And let a husband not send away a wife.
So this verse is the most important here to understand the true intent of all of this divorce and remarriage thing. Why it's so strict is because the woman, she needs to be protected at all costs from being defiled, from receiving multiple seed. The woman's, and see that's the law of mixing seed. And I'm a little bit disappointed in this Messianic Jew guy, because he did not mention that nowhere. And that has so much to do in all of this stuff. All of these laws on divorce, the provisions and all that stuff, and adultery, it is all in order to prevent a woman from getting that second man, from getting mixed, from getting adulterated. And that's why the apostles is confirming all this. If she separates, don't go and get married to another man. Stay single or be reconciled to your husband. Why? Because if you do, you're going to get adulterated. You're going to be mixed. You're going to be defiled. And the husband, don't send away your woman, especially if she's not cheating out, sleeping out on you. If she's not being unfaithful, you're going to cause her to be adulterated, because the woman, she's got some desires, she's got some needs. She's going to go out there, unless a real woman led by the Spirit that's got no fleshly man, and this is hard to come by, rather woman or man. But these are the cards that the Most High Yah dealt with the woman. All right, this is how they've been dealt with, and he's not messing around with this stuff
in divorce. So Paul appears to be paraphrasing Yeshua to some degree here, saying that the command is not his, but the master's, that a husband should not divorce his wife, and a wife should not separate from a husband. And it's not entirely clear what Paul's saying here about the wife, because he uses the word separate rather than send away. Is separation in this context still divorce? It could mean that, since Paul says that if a wife does separate from her husband, she should remain unmarried. Plus,
see, why are we all like messed up in all these? Is it sending out, separate, divorce? It's just talking about her leaving him, being separated from him. It's simple as that. I'm sorry, guys. I'm really passionate, man, when it comes to these subjects. It's all good. It's all good about it. But I'm really passionate. I'm serious about this stuff because the Most High is serious about this stuff.
Plus, this is the same separate word that Yeshua uses when he says, what God joined together, let man not separate. On the other hand, Paul also says that if she separates, she can later be reconciled to her husband, not remarried to, but reconciled, which implies that they never divorced. So the only thing we can say for sure here is that separation...
No, they never divorced. Divorce, all right, we have to look at it this way. You know, when in the church they say, when till death do us part, that's literally how we have to look at divorce. Divorce is death. Whether it's the woman being unfaithful, being defiled, death, put away, or whether it's the man being wicked as hell, being dead, stony heart, that releases the woman. Divorce, we have to equate divorce with death. And then it's going to make a lot more sense.
According to Paul, is some state of unmarriedness. You're no longer living under the same roof, and you're no longer in a functional marriage. And while I'm hesitant to say that in Paul's mind, separation is the exact same thing as divorce, especially given what he literally says about wives divorcing husbands in the next couple of verses, what I do feel confident in saying is that Paul does allow a wife to leave her husband, but only on the condition that she doesn't get involved with another man. So in modern terms, perhaps separation rather than divorce would be the more correct understanding of the wife's options under certain circumstances. In any case, Paul still doesn't want wives leaving husbands and husbands divorcing wives. Separation is still a concession. Then, beginning in verse 12, Paul continues his discussion about divorce, but now in the very specific instance of a believer being married to an unbeliever. In verses 12 and 13, Paul says to them, "And to the rest I speak this, I, not the master. If any brother has an unbelieving wife, and she's pleased to live with him, let him not send her away in divorce.
So this is important to know and understand that this is talking about newcomers coming in. These were people, all right, the apostle, he was out to the Corinthians. These people, they were just coming into the faith, all right? And this was in the context, in the case where the man might be, all right, he receives the gospel, he believes, man, all right, in the words of Jesus, but the woman's like, this is in this context. All he's saying is like, look, y'all have been together, man, since that's the wife of your youth. Don't put her away, all right? Because she's going to be adulterated. If you put her away, she's going to go with that next man and she's going to be adulterated. See, so that's the context. That's the wisdom the apostle is speaking through.
And if any woman has an unbelieving husband, and this one is pleased to live with her, let her not send the husband away in divorce. So this part is pretty cut and dried. Paul's basically answering the question, hey, my spouse isn't a believer. Should I get a divorce? And his answer is basically no, not as long as your spouse is still willing to live with you. And this is really interesting because Paul puts all the control in the hands of the unbelieving spouse. In other words, he doesn't give believers permission to end their marriages just because they no longer like living with an unbeliever, or the unbelieving spouse's behavior or attitudes makes them feel uncomfortable, unhappy, or alone. If the unbelieving spouse is pleased to live with the believer, then you don't have grounds for divorce. That's Paul's command. But then in verse 15, Paul goes on to add this. But if the unbelieving one separates himself, let him separate himself. The brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases, and God has called you to live in peace. So again, Paul uses the word separate rather than send away. So if the unbelieving spouse decides not to stay with the believing spouse, Paul says, it's okay, let them go. What this means for separation versus divorce, however, is still unclear, as before. And Paul's comments about the brother or sister not being under bondage in such cases doesn't bring much clarity. On one hand, it could mean that if the unbelieving spouse leaves, that the believing spouse is no longer bound in marriage. On the other hand, it could just mean that if the unbelieving spouse wants to leave, that the believer is under no obligation to try to keep the marriage together. Paul says, if the unbelieving one separates himself, you can let him, implying that another option is to not let him, to try to keep it together. Instead, Paul says, the brother or sister is not under bondage in the case of an unbelieving spouse wanting to leave.
See, so the appropriate context here, when we're talking about an unbelieving spouse separating, all right, this is in the context of, let's say the man is the believer and the woman is an unbeliever, all right, and she's going out. She wants to separate, all right. The man's not putting her out. She says, to hell with that. I'm not following you in this regeneration. She is separating herself, right? That's the context. Now, on the flip side, and this is going to be a hard pill to swallow, but this is book. If the woman is the one that is the believer, and the husband is unbeliever, and he says, to hell with that, he can say, I'm leaving you, I'm separating. In this case, the word says, let them separate. But he also has, if it's his husband, he also has the authority as an unbeliever to say to her as a believer, to hell with that. You're not going in that regeneration and you're leaving. You're coming with me. We're getting the hell out of here and you're coming with me. And he will be completely justified in doing that, being his husband. This is an important caveat that we have to add in, right? Because the man is the head. He's the headship. Am I saying that this is right and just? Am I saying that he's not going to be visited by the Most High for that, being wicked? No, that's not what I'm saying. But it's still proper order, the man being the authority. Let's move on.
So it's important to remember two things from this verse. First, that you can't use the ambiguity of Paul's language to grant you the outcome that you want. You can't insist that the text is clear when it's obviously not. And second, this verse applies specifically to a marriage with an unbelieving spouse. It can't be applied in any other situation. And short of your believing spouse literally denying Yeshua, literally saying they're no longer submitted to God and his word, you also can't use this verse as an excuse to judge your spouse to be an unbeliever solely based on his or her attitude or actions, and then say, I'm no longer bound to you, I want a divorce. That's stretching these verses way too far. So do any of Paul's commands provide additional grounds for divorce or modify any of Yeshua's teaching? I don't think so. There's no clear, unambiguous statement by Paul that indicates that if a spouse leaves or there's abandonment, or if a spouse initiates a divorce, that the other spouse is therefore released from the marriage and subsequently free to remarry. It just doesn't say that. What his commands do say is that a wife can separate from her husband, as long as she remains in a marital situation that would allow her to later reconcile with him. And in the case of an unbeliever wanting to leave a believer, the believer can feel free to let the unbeliever go. I would even say to the extent that if the unbeliever divorces the believer, that the believer should feel free to grant the divorce. But as for remarriage, I still see nothing here that would grant that freedom. So that's Paul's teaching on divorce in a nutshell. So where does all this leave us as believers where it comes to divorce and remarriage? Well, we know that God hates divorce. Moses allowed it because of the stiffness of people's hearts, but Yeshua says not to do it. That this wasn't the way it was from the beginning, that no one should separate what God has joined together, and that divorce and remarriage constitutes adultery for all parties involved. Paul also says to not divorce, but additionally allows for separation and for believing spouses to let unbelieving spouses leave. Yet the only biblical grounds for a free and clear divorce is in the case of sexual unfaithfulness. So what about marriages where there have been things like emotional affairs or physical abuse or use of pornography? Can these be used as grounds for divorce? Scripture is, of course, silent on all of these, with the possible exception of pornography, which could certainly cross over into adultery of the heart territory. But without the physically adulterous act with another person, I still think, as betraying as it is, that use of pornography still doesn't meet the divorce standard. That doesn't mean you have to just live with it. It means you probably can't divorce over it. If pornography is an issue in your marriage, there are steps you can take to help or confront the spouse who has the addiction. For starters, you can eliminate avenues to access pornography, such as using software like Accountable to You or Covenant Eyes, getting rid of your streaming device or chucking your DVD player, whatever it takes. And if necessary, you can bring other believers into the situation to confront a spouse who isn't willing to give up that addiction, using the principles of Matthew 18. But no matter how a spouse's use of pornography makes you feel, and how legitimately justified those feelings are, it's still worth fighting for your marriage. But of course, if all good faith efforts fail, you can separate and leave, as Paul said. And this would also be the case for emotional affairs or drug or alcohol addiction or physical abuse. If steps to end the destructive behavior doesn't result in healing and restoration and a sense of trust and safety.
Like Paul said, the woman is bound to the law of her husband as long as he lives. So if there's anything like that going on in a relationship where there's really hardships, all right, and it's terrible, y'all better make damn sure before you end up leaving that all avenues have been visited and all resources have been depleted. You cannot just run out because you don't like what's going on. Y'all better make sure that man is plucked out by the roots, twice dead. Because this marriage stuff is serious, man.
safety, then one biblical solution is to leave. You aren't free at that point to remarry, but you can get out of the bad situation and on with your life. And of course, any situation in which your kids are in some kind of danger, get them out of there now and work out the details later. But if you're in a less severe situation right now and you're contemplating separation or divorce, not for sexual unfaithfulness, in which case you're...
See, that's another thing. Kids being in some kind of danger. Like, by whose standard? Like, who the hell determines what is a danger to children? I mean, if you put that in a woman's standard, every damn little thing is going to be dangerous to a children. So I hope we don't put that to a woman's standard. Hope there's some wise elders that are really be able to adjudicate matters righteously. Damn, because if that's the case, there would be no children around, no man at any time. We all know what I'm talking about. I'm sure you all are.
You're free to divorce, though you don't have to. But for whatever other reason, you need to remember right now that the covenant you made with your spouse before God is never supposed to be broken. The righteous thing to do is remain in your marriage and try to work it out. You need to do it for you, for your spouse, your children, your extended family, and also for your testimony.
All right, so I guess he's giving video is almost done. I guess he's giving a few of his understanding and counsel for some people in relationships. Well, I got to say, I'm a little bit disappointed at biblically correct. I'm a little bit disappointed in his approach. He's had some truths, but there was a lot of non-truths. There was a lot of half-truths. There was a few points that he mentioned there that are right, that lines up with the word, lines up with scripture. But I'm going to have to say, in a general sense, from this Messianic Jew, I'm a little disappointed, man. I'm a little disappointed. So to make a conclusion on this, marriage is really important. Marriage is hella important. All right. And I'm going to pull this verse to show the example, to give an example of how important marriage is. All right. Deuteronomy 22:19. Right. And they shall immerse him in 100 shekels of silver and give them unto the father of the damsel, because he had brought up an evil name upon a virgin of Israel, and she shall be his wife. He may not put her away all his days. Right? This is when a man slanders a woman. Right? Deuteronomy 22:29. Then the man that lay with her shall give unto the damsels. That's the verses I was specifically looking for. He's going to give the damsel's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife. Because he had humbled her, he may not put her away all his days. So this is putting emphasis on the importance of marriage. It's a life thing, right? So next one, just to cover, Deuteronomy 24, right? When a man had taken a wife and married her, and it come to pass that she finds no favor in his eyes, because he had found some uncleanness in her. He found something in her. He's seen something. And that something is tied with what Jesus was talking about. Fornication, unfaithfulness. She's defiled. Then let him write her a bill of divorcement and give it in her hand and send her out of his house. And when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. Now, if that woman is wrongly put away, being without fault, she should not go and jump and be another man's wife. She should try to reconcile to her husband, because then if she does, she's going to be defiled. Because verse 3, it tells us, and if the latter husband hate her and write her a bill of divorce and give it in her hand and send her out of his house, or if the later husband die, which took her to be his wife, her former husband, which sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife. After that, she is defiled. She's not just defiled to the previous husband. She is defiled for all. I mean, think about it. The woman, once she's taken from that second man, okay, she becomes defiled. So you as a man, what kind of man would you be? So you know this woman, she's been with that man all her life. She's known only one man. And something happens with them, man, they end up being separated or divorced. And then the first thing you go is you go all up in her skirt, try to secure her for yourself. No, a righteous man would try to understand, hey, what's going on? What's going on with you and your ex? Well, you know, the woman, if she's like, well, you know, he's accusing me, man, of sleeping out and being unfaithful, but I didn't do no such thing. And if she's right, see, that's how you actually work things out to be reconciled to your husband. You don't just jump to the next Tom, Dick, and Harry. See, that's how you remain holy. That's how you remain undefiled. And that's what the apostles were talking about when they're talking about a woman trying to be reconciled to her husband. And if not, if all else fails, and a husband is just wicked, evil, right? Then the woman just remain unreproachable. And the Most High, he'll visit you, or he'll visit him. Believe me. The Most High, David says, I've never seen the righteous forsaken. All right? So, next verse that's really important. To tie all these in together. All right, Matthew 5:32. But I say unto you that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causes her to commit adultery. And whosoever shall marry her that is divorced, commit adultery. Right? So this is the importance on the Most High. The Most High's will and mission for his daughters in Israel is for them to remain undefiled. Right? Undefiled. And next verse that is really important to tie all these in together, to understand, have good comprehension. Romans 7:2, for the woman which had a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. So then if while her husband lived, she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from the law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. So all these things, they all tie up with the words of Jesus. It all ties up with Deuteronomy 24, Deuteronomy 22. The defilement, the uncleanness, it all ties up together. All right. So if y'all have any questions, man, I've been in for over an hour. Hope this was a blessing to y'all. And hey, I know I'm passionate when I come to these subject, man. So y'all give me some grace, and y'all forgive me for the passion, which really there's nothing to be forgiven about. But yeah, if you have any questions, if there's anything that y'all need me to clarify, check out what I'm saying. Let's see if what I'm saying lines up with scriptures or not. If it doesn't, bring it out. Let's bring it out and let's tackle this. Let's look at it together, because Most High, man, he's looking for, he wants his people to be, not to be mixed into all these say one thing one time and say another thing another time. He wants consistency in his people, and he wants them to rightly divide the word of truth. Hallelujah. So bless y'all. Shalom, shalom. If there's anything, y'all let me know. Send me a shout, and I hope y'all do very well. Catch y'all later.